We'll go ahead and get started. Quick introductions. My name is Katie English. I'm a product manager for Jamf Pro, and I'm joined by Paul Bowden. How are you, Paul?
I'm great, thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us here. So I'm Paul Bowden. I'm an engineer on the Microsoft Office for Mac team out of Redmond, Washington, and I own manageability and deployment for Office for Mac.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being here, Paul. Quick run through the agenda today. We're going to talk about how to deploy Office for Mac and how to configure it with application settings and policies. How to deploy profiles specific to macOS Catalina, and how to keep your Office deployment up to date. So we'll hand it over to Paul to start talking about Office for Mac.
Okay, perfect. So hi. So we have many native Mac apps available at Microsoft, and today we're mainly going to be talking about what I refer to as the core Office applications, and that is Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, OneNote, and OneDrive. So all of those apps are available both in the Apple Mac App Store and also from office.com. And one of the key talking points for today will be deciding which is the best route for you to acquire Office. So a lot of those core apps, they share common traits, whether it be kind of UI metaphors, and even they share a lot of code in terms of management. And we'll also see today how those apps can be managed either individually or you can manage them like centrally as a suite. So outside of the core apps, we have other apps. These are only available through office.com. They're not available in the Mac App Store, but they're Teams, Skype for Business, Intune Company Portal, Defender, Advanced Threat Protection, as well as the new Chromium-based Edge browser, which publicly released just a short few weeks ago. And then finally, we also have Microsoft Auto Update, or MAU, which is the tool to keep all apps up to date. So those are all the native apps inside the Office for Mac suite. Okay, so I thought before we go any further, it would be interesting just to take a moment to talk about how Office is licensed, as this is really important to understand for proper configuration management. So we have two fundamental licensing options. The first is the older style perpetual license, and that's where you purchase the software and you own it forever. So for consumers, we normally talk about licenses such as home and student and home and business. For commercial organizations, we usually use the term volume license. And that's where Office can be activated with a separate tool, which we call the VL serializer. So all those perpetual licenses are tied to a generation of the product. The latest generation is 2019, but some of you may still have the older 2016 generation deployed. The way that you can tell the difference between the generations is through the build number. So builds 16.17 or later are the 2019 generation, and then the 2016 generation, those latest builds are 16.16. Something. So be aware that those perpetual licenses are only supported for 5 years. Now you can run the software for longer than 5 years, but we only maintain that branch of software with fixes and enhancements for that 5-year period. So any of you still used in the 2016 generation, you want to take note that end of life for that branch is October of this year. So after that date, we'll no longer produce any more 16.16 builds, and everything will be 2019 generation. And then apart from perpetual, we also have a newer style of licensing, which we mainly talk about, and that is subscription-based with Office 365. And this is more of a pay-as-you-go model. It's important to understand that there's actually no real difference in installation techniques and packaging between perpetual and subscription. It's simply based on the way that you activate the software. So that kind of shared packaging definitely simplifies the deployment story. It also makes it really easy to move between licenses. Some of you may start out life deploying Office 2019 with a volume license, and then maybe later on your business wants to switch to Office 365. The great thing here is that, well, it's the same physical install on the machine, and all you really need to do to convert that license type is to delete one plist file and then activate again. Okay, so what we're also here, let's talk about how we think of macOS version support. So we changed our stance here a couple of months ago, a couple of years ago. So starting with the 2019 generation of Office, we took this hard line in only supporting the 3 most current versions of macOS in the market. And many IT admins will know this as our N-2 model, where we support the latest major release, which would be N, and then the 2 previous major releases. So what that means today is the kind of the best and recommended operating system for Office is 10.15 Catalina, so that's our N. But we also support 10.14 and 10.13 for Office as well. We really try hard to make the feature set the same, no matter which version of macOS you're using. And because of the shared packaging we talked about a few minutes ago, this macOS support applies equally for both 2019 volume license and Office 365 deployments. So as time moves forward and Apple releases new major versions of macOS, which tend to happen on this kind of very rhythmic model, this version support becomes a sliding window. So where a new version is added, the oldest version is dropped from support. And this shift happened a few months ago, as we used to support 10.12 Sierra for Office, but once Catalina released, then we kind of shifted that window forward and embraced Catalina, and then we had to drop support for 10.12. And that dropping of support is very much this hard stance where you can no longer install that generation of Office on that older operating system. So taking a lead from Jamf, Microsoft is truly committed to 0-day support for the core Office apps. And this sliding window of macOS versions allows us to take advantage of new APIs and technologies that become available in the new versions of macOS, so that we can get like the best Office experience out to you without carrying the overheads and complexity of the OS features that are no longer serviced by Apple. So that's the reason why we have that sliding window. So I mentioned a little earlier that as of January of last year, we support both acquiring Office in the Mac App Store and also from our content delivery network, our CDN, or what I'll refer to here as office.com. And you may be wondering which option is better. So I put together this quick workflow to help you decide the best path for your environment. And it's based on 4 questions that you should ask yourself. And the answers to these questions really become the deciding point as to where you should get Office from. So the first question is that when you install Office from the Mac App Store, we only support the subscription license model, not volume license. So you need to be Office 365. If you are Office 365, then you check that box and then you move forward to the next question. And this is probably the biggest deciding factor for you, this number 2, and that is the use of the Apple ID. So if your users are assigned their own Apple ID, and that may be it's a managed Apple ID through Apple School Manager or Apple Business Manager, or even if they're using a personal Apple ID, they'll actually get a very smooth deployment and update experience. And if you have content caching enabled on your network, both those new installs and updates of Office can occur very quickly. Many of you out there might not be assigning Apple IDs for your users, and while it is possible to perform the initial deployment of Office from the Mac App Store without the user having an Apple ID, the monthly update experience, I would say, is not so smooth. And it really requires users to regularly shut down their applications. And so in many cases, you'll find that users won't be able to update their apps easily or get notifications of updates. So I would recommend that if you are not using Apple IDs for your users, then you switch down to using the Office.com builds. However, if you are using Apple ID, the next question that you should ask is about your strict version requirements. So the Mac App Store can only serve the very latest monthly build of Office. If you're in an environment where you regularly deploy older versions of Office, say for compatibility reasons, then the Mac App Store is likely not the best choice for you. And then finally, Microsoft makes available the Insider program, and this is where users can get early access to builds and new features. These are obtained through what we call the Insider's Fast or Insider's Slow channel. However, only the final production build is available from the Mac App Store. So if you want some of your users on the Insider program, you should get the builds from Office.com. If you have no need for the Insider program, then you can move forward and use that Mac App Store deployment. Regardless of the installation vehicle, regardless of your choice here for acquiring Office, the final end user experience is almost indistinguishable when looking at the product. And if I walked up to your machine, and it would actually take me a couple of minutes to actually figure out whether you deployed Office from the Mac App Store or from Office.com. The user experience is designed to be exactly the same. So if you've never looked at it, this is a screenshot of where you would go with inside the Jamf Pro UI to configure your deployment from the Mac App Store. You add the Office applications individually to this list. Now, there is no option to deploy the suite as such. And in fact, the number of licenses available, what you see in Jamf, is very specific to what you had provisioned in Apple Business Manager or Apple Store Manager. So, so that's the portal that you would use, first of all, to acquire the licenses. And then that license list is going to show up inside the Jamf Pro UI. And then once you set the scope for those applications, Jamf will issue the install application, MDM command, and that'll perform the physical installation of the required Office app on the user's device. So as the Office app uses this free to download model, commercial users don't actually purchase Office through the Mac App Store. Users are simply activating one of the licenses on your existing subscription plan. You may have a plan such as A3 or A5 or E3, E5, and that's a 365 subscription, and users are simply activating one of their existing licenses which you had purchased separately. If alternatively you want to go for an Office.com deployment method, you first need to obtain the physical PKG installers. And you can use these pseudo links, also known as forward links, on the slide here to obtain the very latest production build. And while these URLs remain constant, the destination package is updated around the middle of each month, so that whenever you go to this URL to get your package, you will always get the latest build. The links you see on this slide are the single funnel point for Office downloads. So for example, if you were to log on to the Office 365 portal and click on the download Office link there, you'll be actually routed to the same pseudo link as you see here. There really is no difference as to how you acquire that download. I also maintain a website called macadmins.software, which is useful for more complex deployments, such as cases where you need to obtain a specific version of Office, like you need an older version, or if you want to obtain the installers for each app rather than the entire suite. Nonetheless, we worked really hard over the last few years to remove all the reasons for why you might need to repackage our installers. And I thoroughly recommend that for deploying Office, you simply take our PKGs and you push them out. There is no need to expand them and change them and repackage them. I added this optional step 2 to this slide. So for those of you that are using the older volume license method rather than subscription, in this case, you need to log on to the Volume License Service Center to obtain this small 5 megabyte package called the VL Serializer. And you run this in addition to the Office installer to stamp the volume license on each of your users' computers. So you run the Office install, you then run the volume license, and then those two packages together give you that full Office VL experience. So once you've got all the PKGs you next need to upload them to your Jamf distribution point. And this is usually performed through the Jamf Web UI, but you can also automate it through tools such as JSS Importer. Once you have the packages up there, finally you create a policy which will deploy the packages. And people will either set the policy to automatically install Office, where you push it out proactively for your users, or if you don't want to give everybody Office, you can make it available as an optional download in self-service. Okay, so those are really the very simple steps, and it is very straightforward to get the Office bits deployed to your computers. So let's turn our attention to configuration management, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Katie.
Thanks, Paul. So taking a bit of a step back, preference management is one of those abstract topics that's a little bit difficult to understand. So just want to dive into it a little bit here. Preference management really falls into two levels. There's the preference domain, which is where basically a container for preferences for an entire application bundle. And then within that preference domain are preference keys, which are actually the individual preferences for settings within the application. So if we take a look at our file system, you can actually see that preferences are kind of scattered all over the place. And depending where they are, they might impact either just the user environment or they might impact the entire file system. So if you take a look at the list here on the screen, if something lives at /library/preferences, that's very likely going to be a system-wide preference versus the tilde, which would indicate that it's user space only. If something lives in library managed preferences, that was delivered by a management framework like Jamf Pro. If you go looking for these files in your file system, you'll see them represented in what's called reverse domain format. So that's effectively com.vendor.softwaretitle.plist. The plist at the end is the file extension. It stands for property list. You can actually go find these files, take a look at them, and even preview them in Finder's Quick Look function. Take a look at their contents. But the thing is, you don't want to manipulate them directly in the Finder. Most of these files are in a binary format rather than ASCII readable text, and there are multiple layers of caching, so if you modify one of these files, you might not actually see it take effect immediately. This is a quick cheat sheet for all of the Office preference domains. So you can see here capitalization can be important, and if you're looking around for particular files, you might miss it if you don't capture the case properly. So that's just something to keep an eye out for. And when we look at the contents of these preference keys, they're almost human readable. So you can actually see within a preference domain, you can actually preview it, you can see the contents, you can see a key, you can see the value that's assigned to the key. And it's usually pretty easy to match up what the end user experience will be against the defined value in the file. So if you, the admin, take the time to curate that end user experience, when the end user launches their app, they get moving that much more quickly. There are a lot of different ways to manage preferences. So you can script, you can overwrite the plist files, you can use configuration profiles. So we did some creative things with our partnership with Microsoft to solve this in a creative way. So Paul's going to tell us a little bit about how that went.
Sure. So over the last couple of years, I'm as a Jamf IT admin myself, sometimes it gets really frustrating trying to handcraft those property list files where I'll miss one of the closing tags in the XML structure, or I'll make a simple typo when defining those key names. So we really wanted to make this easier, and so it was really great that JNUC just gone, that we both stood on stage and we announced this new feature that was in Jamf Pro 10.18. And this is where Microsoft and Jamf work together to bring you this much easier way to set preference keys for the Office apps. So instead of that manual crafting, you can use this familiar forms-based approach. And some of the underlying key names are pretty obscure, but the Forms engine in Jamf Pro allows us to easily hide that complexity and provide you with the plain English explanations of the settings and give you a reason as to why you may want to use them. And if we head over to the next slide here, I think we've gone one slide ahead. One more, okay. So for those of you that are familiar with handcrafting property lists, there's actually this great code inspection facility in the Jamf Pro Web UI that you can use to correlate the setting on the form with the underlying structure that will be sent to the device. And you can actually see that it looks like an XML tag icon over in the right-hand side of that screenshot on the right. So kind of walking through an example that we have on the screen, in the form, we see an option to disable cloud fonts, and that is a Boolean, so you set it to true or false. When you set that control to true, there will be a corresponding key that is created in the plist structure called disable cloud fonts with the right casing, and that will be added to this this property list with a value of true. It's worth calling out that all of the settings exposed in the form have this default value. So for example, by default, cloud fonts are not disabled, which means users can use cloud fonts. That's exactly what the default is inside the Office applications. And that's also the default that we carry into this form here. However, you may run into scenarios where you don't want to send any value to the client, not even false. And you purely want to let the user decide on a particular setting. And in this case, you add you use the add remove keys button inside this payload to prevent those settings from being included in the property list. So by unchecking some of those checkboxes, you reduce the size of the plist and those keys don't get sent down to the users.
Thanks, Paul. And so besides the actual Office experience, there's a lot of other preferences that we can manage here. Starting in macOS 10.15 Catalina, if you've upgraded, you've probably seen a few of these windows pop up on your screen. This functionality from Apple offers end users very granular control over the notifications that an app can display via pop-up, notification center, sound, or icon badge. And a lot of these are kind of like one and done. You launch the app, it asks for you, the user's preference, and then it just remembers it for next time. But the problem for an administrator is sometimes you want notifications to be on. The desired end result is that the end user knows when something important happens. So, Paul, what notifications are helpful for Office users, and how would you recommend managing them?
Sure. So we have Office Notifications configuration payload that you can deploy through Jamf Pro to get your users up and running quickly. So we defined the best practices such as having Microsoft Auto Update be allowed to send notifications, having things like Outlook being able to badge the icon so it can show the users how many new emails they have. And we encoded them all into this one mobile config file. And you can either take that mobile config file, you download it from the link on the slide, and you can modify it if you wish, or you can simply upload it directly to Jamf Pro.
Excellent. So just to note, in upcoming versions of Jamf Pro, admins will be able to easily whitelist notifications both for Jamf's self-service and the Jamf management framework. And then later on, we'll also add options to whitelist notifications for unique app bundles, just like Paul describes here. This next slide is a bit of a mouthful. Privacy Preferences Policy Control. This was added in macOS 10.14 Mojave, and it's meant to give users greater visibility and control over the amount of access an app has across the OS and hardware. So it prevents an application or process from controlling another application or process without user consent. So, for example, Terminal cannot run scripts calling Apple system events to display macOS dialogues without alerting the user and requesting permission. It also prevents an application or process from accessing user information such as files in their home folder, or the camera, or the microphone, location, etc. For example, Google Chrome cannot access your Mac's camera and microphone to use Google Hangouts without alerting the user and requesting that they set permission. So, what PPPC controls does Office require, and how best do we deploy them?
So similar to what we did for notifications, we also have this pre-built privacy payload that you can deploy that allows both Terminal and the Jamf binary to control Microsoft Auto Update. And this is important for those of you that want to orchestrate Office updates through Jamf Pro. Now, while IT admins can whitelist certain operating system and hardware functions, it should be noted that there are some facilities that only the user themselves can allow. And similar to what Katie was talking about with Google Hangouts, for example, Teams and Skype for Business will request a screen recording facility to share content, but that's not something that you as the IT admin can whitelist. It must be presented to the user, and the user must authorize those apps directly. So in addition to uploading our pre-built privacy payload, recent versions of Jamf Pro also allow you to define a privacy payload in a form, which is much easier to manage. However, there are some pretty obscure values that you have to copy and paste into that form. Sometimes it can take a little getting used to. Regardless of how you choose to define your payload, the result is that on your end user's device, you can go into the list of profiles that they have on the machine, and you should see the privacy payloads there. And in fact, the screenshot on the right here shows me my Jamf controller for msupdate. And when I scroll down that, I can see who the developer was and what the actual control allows for. So switching gears, and I want to talk about another really important topic, and that is staying up to date. It's really easy to deploy your first install of Office, but then updates happen, and for the core Office apps, we use a monthly release cadence for getting production quality updates out to you. So those updates may include bug fixes, security fixes, performance enhancements, new features. They're all rolled into one. And while you generally notice that Office and Mac updates appear around the middle of each month, there's actually some predictable math behind our release schedule. You find the last Sunday in a given month and add 16 days. And this will be a Tuesday, and it'll be the day that we release our updates. If you went down the Mac App Store route, there's actually nothing for you to do. Your users will get updated automatically because we release to the Mac App Store and to the Office CDN at the same time. For Office.com deployments, you do have some flexibility and choice over how and when those updates are applied. And fundamentally, there are three different approaches that you can take for coordinating your updates. And I want to explain each one in detail and why you would use them. So the first strategy is probably the easiest to deploy, but it provides limited control to IT. So when you deploy Office, Microsoft Auto Update will get automatically deployed and configured on each user's machine. There will be a launch agent that'll wake up and check the Microsoft network for updates every 12 hours. If it finds updates, it'll automatically download and install them. The kind of cool thing here is for any apps that are in a closed state, Mal will simply apply those updates in the background silently, so the next time the user launches that app, they will already be up to date. For apps that are held open, and I always think of Outlook as the prime example because nobody wants to close their email, Once an update is ready to be applied, the user will be asked via a notification if they want to restart the app to apply the update. So the pros and cons of strategy number one here is, well, it works out of the box and you really don't need to do anything to set it up. You just deploy Office and it's a complete client-side solution. You can also make use of Mao's inbuilt capabilities where it can very kind of tactically go and get the right package to keep that user up to date. And that really does minimize the size of the package over the network. And the other pro is that, of course, there's good coordination with the user, where the user is informed of what this experience is and whether they should be closing apps or not. On the con side, there's little to no control as to when, how, and where updates take place, and there's limited ability to force the update deadlines. And I would say that I see this particular scenario most used in the BYOD, or bring your own device environments. If I go, I want to flip down a couple of slides here. Okay, to the monthly Office update size. So I mentioned that Mao has this ability to intelligently get the right package to get you updated. And we're always working on better ways to improve update efficiency. And a key aspect that we focus on is the size of monthly updates. And the chart in this slide shows the updates sent to our production channel over the last 18 months, with each of these vertical bars representing a 1-month production release. And there are 3 interesting takeaways from this slide. The first is that the size of the monthly updates do vary depending on how much change there's been to the underlying code. And the spikes that you see in this chart are caused by the addition of new proofing tools and new languages. So, when we add Portuguese, for example, as an update, then you will see a spike occur. So the second point is that there's been this dramatic decrease in the update size in the last 6 months. And this is the result from our release of ultra thin updates, where we use a very different engine to build the update package. Previously, what we did is we would just do a file-based diff and ship you whole new versions of file for changes. But now we've got a little tighter, and we now use a binary-based diff engine, where even at the kind of individual binary level, we can calculate the delta differences in a binary and pack them so that we can make those updates as small as possible. And our 16.33 update, which we released just a few short weeks ago, you can see is at that 162 meg level. So we're really kind of nice and consistently small across the suite now. The last takeaway is that hot fixes are extremely small. So it can be rare, but in some circumstances, we need to release a hot fix outside of our normal monthly cycle. And you can see that we actually did have a 16.29.1 hotfix that we needed to release. And that's the smallest bar on this chart here, and that was a mere 24 megabytes in size. And so that's 24 megabytes, and we were able to patch all of the core Office apps with that update. So that's just ways that we're what we're using to keep your bandwidth overheads to a minimum. So the second strategy that I want to talk about is kind of what I call as the big hammer, and it's the approach at the opposite end of the spectrum. So in this case, you're not waiting or relying on Microsoft Auto Update to do any work. So instead, you use a pure server-side logic in Jamf Pro to control precisely when the update will occur. So this is a fantastic way if you want to deploy updates on a Wednesday at 8 p.m. because you get that granularity of when that kickoff time happens. It is also kind of a great way to forcibly update Office across the fleet. For example, perhaps there is a active security vulnerability that you're worried about, and it's really key for you to just blow through your environment and get everybody up to date as soon as possible. And so this kind of push approach is the best option there. It does come at the expense that it is usually the most disruptive for the user as well, because any apps that they have open will be forcibly closed as part of the update. And while there is attempts with inside our scripts to get those apps closed in a graceful manner, get caches flushed, any file changes saved, the user really doesn't have any ability to snooze the update there. It simply will forcibly happen. The other con with this approach is that you cannot take advantage of the size reductions that we talked about in the last slide. So instead, you're going to be, pushing the full updater packages or the full suite installer, and that's going to be about 2 gigabytes worth of network traffic per device. So I would say this strategy is best suited for those kind of like active security vulnerability where you need to get everything up to date ASAP, or if you're in a classroom environment and you just want to get all those machines updated. And then the third strategy is to use a combination of server and client-side logic. And this is where we use Jamf Pro to trigger MAU to update. And it provides a middle ground. And I would say it's arguably the best option for most environments. And here you get the best of both worlds, where you can take advantage of those small update sizes that MAU knows about, but you also get that scheduling capability where you can get very fine grain as to when those updates occur. And here we're using Jamf Pro scripting facility to trigger the MAU client through the means of MAU's command line interface, which is called msupdate. On the con side, it does require a little more upfront configuration, and there's a trigger script that we make available for you where you need to take that trigger script and copy that into a script in Jamf Pro, and then you can configure that script via a policy to initiate the updates. Okay, and then finally, let's talk about something else which is pretty neat in Jamf Pro. Katie, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. So regardless of which strategy you're using to patch your Office deployment, we have this patch reporting facility built into Jamf Pro, and it'll quickly tell you what versions your managed devices are running. So if you go to Jamf Pro in Computers and select Patch Management from the left sidebar, you can click New to add a supported software title to your list, and we have a lot of Microsoft Office titles in there. And then once you save, you can quickly see the percentage of devices across your managed fleet that are running the most recent version, as well as those that might be falling behind. And that's kind of the whole widget there. So we've talked about packaging Office, or grabbing the packages, deploying them, all of the different options to manage, and then maintaining them over time. And Paul, thank you so much for joining in.
It was a pleasure, and thank you so much, everybody, for spending your time with us this morning here. We really do appreciate it.
Have a great day.